Okay, so you've given us some really interesting Supreme Court cases to look at, and as always, we're going to try to pull out the key insights from all these cases.
That's right.
And for this deep dive, we're really zeroing in on McCulloch v. Maryland, trying to understand those fundamental legal ideas it established and how they kind of echo or ripple through these other Supreme Court decisions, like Gibbons v. Ogden, Gonzalez v. Raich, even NFIB v. Sebelius.
Right.
It's like we're tracing the DNA of McCulloch through legal history.
Exactly.
To see how its legacy shapes the whole balance of power between the federal government and the states.
It's really fascinating to see how McCulloch acts as this sort of foundational blueprint for how our federal system works, especially when you have those moments where federal and state interests kind of bump up against each other.
Okay, so let's dive into McCulloch v. Maryland. To really get why it matters so much,
Yeah.
we need to rewind a bit back to the early 1800s.
Okay.
We had the first Bank of the United States, its charter expired, and then in 1816 comes the second Bank of the United States.
Right.
But this really reignited the debate, didn't it, about how much power the federal government should actually have.
Oh, absolutely. The memory of potentially overreaching federal power was still very much on people's minds.
Yeah.
You know, the Constitution was still relatively new, and there were definitely parts that were open to interpretation.
Yeah.
And one of the big sticking points was this whole idea of implied powers.
Right.
The Constitution didn't explicitly say Congress could create a national bank.
Right.
And there was a lot of concern that giving Congress that kind of power would lead to a federal government that could do whatever it wanted and basically stomp all over the state's authority.
It's that classic tension, right, between a strong national government and preserving the power of the states.
Absolutely, a tension that's woven through so much of American history.
You had folks like Alexander Hamilton arguing for a broad interpretation, saying a national bank was critical for a stable economy.
Right.
And on the flip side, you had Thomas Jefferson and his allies who were big on states' rights.
Yeah.
They wanted the federal government to stick to only those powers specifically spelled out in the Constitution.
Right.
So it was a real battle of ideas about how to interpret this brand new framework for governing a nation.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see how that initial debate played out.
So Washington ended up siding with Hamilton.
Right.
The first bank was established. It ran for its 20 years. Then its charter lapsed.
Right.
But then fast forward a few years and we get the second bank.
Yeah, and that's where things get really interesting.
So James Madison, who had actually opposed the first bank, ends up signing the bill that creates the second bank in 1816.
That's right.
It's like maybe he felt like by then it was settled that the bank was constitutional.
It's possible that the political and economic landscape had shifted enough by that point,
Right?
that the idea of a national bank didn't seem quite as radical or threatening as it once did.
But even with the second bank becoming a reality, the controversy didn't just vanish, did it?
Oh, definitely not. As branches of the national bank started popping up in different states,
Right.
they ran into a lot of pushback.
For a whole bunch of reasons.
Yeah, there are a few key factors at play.
First off, you had these national bank branches going head-to-head with the banks that were chartered by the states.
Right.
Back then, we didn't have one single national currency.
No.
State banks were issuing their own banknotes, and so was the Bank of the United States.
Right, so you had this whole mix of different currencies floating around, which could create complications.
And there were all these rumors flying around.
Yeah.
Accusations about some shady dealings and even outright corruption within certain branches of the second bank.
Right.
Which definitely didn't make people feel any warmer towards it.
Not at all. It fueled that distrust that some people already had towards a powerful national institution.
But I think the biggest issue was that a lot of states felt like the federal government was stepping on their toes by trying to dictate how state-level banking should work.
Yeah.
Especially when it came to how much paper money state banks were allowed to issue.
That's right. That was a major point of contention.
So you had all this tension building up.
Yeah.
A real clash brewing between the powers of the federal government and the states.
It was a perfect storm for a legal challenge.
Right.
One that would force the Supreme Court to decide once and for all where the lines were drawn.
And that's where Maryland jumps into the story.
That's right. Maryland enters stage left.
So Maryland, they weren't exactly thrilled about having this national bank branch operating in Baltimore.
No, they were not.
And they came up with a pretty clever scheme to deal with it.
They did.
They passed a law that slapped a tax on any bank doing business in Maryland that wasn't chartered by the state of Maryland.
Clever and strategic.
And guess what? The only bank in Maryland that fit that description was.
No.
It was the second bank of the United States.
Of course.
It wasn't exactly subtle, was it?
It was a pretty clear attempt to put the national bank at a disadvantage,
to make it harder for them to compete with the state-chartered banks.
Right.
But James McCulloch, the guy running the Baltimore branch of the National Bank,
Yeah.
he decided he wasn't going to just roll over and pay this tax.
He took a stand.
And that's what set the whole legal battle in motion.
Right. Maryland sued McCulloch, arguing that they had the right as a state to tax businesses within their borders,
Yeah.
and that the Constitution never explicitly gave Congress the authority to create a national bank in the first place.
Yeah, it was a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the bank itself.
Absolutely.
But McCulloch's defense relied on that all-important phrase,
Yeah.
necessary and proper.
Right.
He argued that setting up a national bank was necessary and proper for Congress to actually do its job,
Yeah.
to carry out its responsibilities, which was one of those implied powers we were talking about.
It was a crucial argument about how much flexibility Congress had under the Constitution.
Right.
Could it only act on powers specifically listed, or could it take actions that were reasonably connected to those powers?
The case went to the Maryland Court of Appeals,
Right.
and they sided with the state,
They did.
setting the stage for this major showdown at the Supreme Court.
This was a case with huge implications.
Right.
It wasn't just about a bank or a tax. It was about defining the very nature of federalism in the United States.
So here we are at the Supreme Court, and the big legal questions are pretty clear.
Right.
First off, does Congress actually have the power under the Constitution to create a national bank?
That's question number one.
And second, if they do, can a state like Maryland come in and tax a branch of that bank?
That gets to the heart of the relationship between federal and state authority.
And the answer to those questions, they really hinge on some key parts of the Constitution.
Yeah, we're talking bedrock principles here.
We're talking Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, the Necessary and Proper Clause.
Right.
You've got Article 6, Clause 2, the Supremacy Clause.
Which basically says that when federal law and state law clash, the federal law wins out.
Right.
It's the supreme law of the land.
And we can't forget about the 10th Amendment.
Of course, which reserves all those powers that aren't specifically given to the federal government, to
Right.
the states, or to the people.
So McCulloch's lawyers, they argued that the Necessary and Proper Clause was all about giving Congress the wiggle room it needed to actually govern effectively.
Right.
It's like the Constitution lays out the big picture, the goals.
Yeah, broad strokes.
But Congress needs to be able to choose the right tools to actually achieve those goals.
It's like having a toolbox.
Right.
You have the basic tools, but you might need to use them in different ways, or even create new tools to get the job done.
Exactly. So they argued that creating a national bank was a reasonable and practical way for Congress to carry out its responsibilities.
Right.
Responsibilities like regulating taxes, borrowing money, managing the country's finances, even raising and supporting armies.
And crucially, they pointed to the Supremacy Clause,
Yeah.
arguing that a state law can't be allowed to interfere with a legitimate exercise of federal power.
It's about establishing that hierarchy, right?
Exactly.
Federal law trumps state law when they're in direct conflict.
That's the essence of the Supremacy Clause.
But Maryland, they took a much stricter view of the Constitution.
Right. They were sticking to the letter of the law.
Their argument was basically, if it's not spelled out word for word in the Constitution,
Yeah.
then Congress doesn't have the power to do it.
A very literal interpretation.
They leaned hard on the 10th Amendment,
Yeah.
emphasizing all those powers that are reserved to the states.
They were concerned about protecting state sovereignty.
Right. And they also said that the power to tax is a core power that both the federal and state governments share.
Right. It's a concurrent power.
And they argued that this national bank was basically barging in and messing with their control over their own state economy and their own financial system.
It was a question of economic autonomy and control.
So we have these two very different interpretations of the Constitution.
Yeah. It was a real clash of legal philosophies.
And the Supreme Court had to decide which one would win out.
And this is where Chief Justice John Marshall steps in and delivers his opinion for the court.
A unanimous decision, wasn't it?
It was a unanimous decision, which is pretty remarkable given how significant and controversial this case was.
So what did they decide?
They said, yes, Congress does have the implied power to create a national bank.
They did.
They based this on the Necessary and Proper Clause, arguing that the clause wasn't meant to restrict Congress, but to give it the flexibility to choose the best way to carry out its duties.
So it's not just about what's explicitly written down.
No, it's about the spirit of the Constitution.
Right.
It's about recognizing that a government needs to be able to adapt to changing circumstances.
So as long as the goal is legitimate and within the bounds of the Constitution,
Right.
and the means are appropriate and not specifically forbidden.
Exactly. then Congress has the power to act.
And they decided that establishing a national bank fit that criteria.
Right. It was seen as a vital tool for Congress to manage the nation's finances and carry out its other responsibilities.
But they didn't stop there, did they?
They did not.
The court also addressed Maryland's tax on the national bank.
And this is where the Supremacy Clause really takes center stage.
Right.
The court declared Maryland's tax unconstitutional, and they said, and I'm quoting here, "The Constitution and the laws made in pursuance thereof are supreme, that they control the Constitution and laws of the respective states, and cannot be controlled by them."
That's a pretty powerful statement.
It's a statement that really lays down the law when it comes to the balance of power between the federal government and the states.
It's saying that the Constitution and federal law are the top dogs.
Right. They take precedence over state law.
So the court made it crystal clear that states can't try to block or undermine legitimate federal actions through things like taxes or any other means.
It was a decisive win for the authority of the federal government.
And it set a crucial precedent for how our federal system would work when federal and state laws bump heads.
McCulloch v. Maryland was a landmark case in so many ways.
This is huge.
It wasn't just about a bank. It was about fundamentally defining the balance of power in our federal system.
Right.
It affirmed that when federal law and state law clash, federal law is supreme.
And it really solidified the concept of implied powers.
Right, which broadened the scope of what Congress could do, even if those actions weren't explicitly listed in the Constitution.
So McCulloch set the stage for a more powerful and flexible federal government.
It gave the federal government the tools it needed to address national issues and adapt to changing times.
And these core principles, they didn't just fade away.
No, they became cornerstones of our legal system.
They've been at the heart of countless cases since then where the scope of federal power has been challenged.
Exactly.
Like in Gibbons v. Ogden in 1824, just a few years after McCulloch.
Right. The Steamboat case.
The Steamboat case.
It's a great example of how McCulloch's principles were applied in a completely different context.
So remind us, what was the connection there to McCulloch?
So in Gibbons, you had this conflict over who had the right to regulate steamboat operation.
Go ahead.
New York State had given this exclusive license to operate steamboats on its waters to a couple of guys named Livingston and Fulton.
Right.
And then they gave a franchise to Ogden to run steamboats between New York and New Jersey. But then Gibbons, he gets a federal license authorized by Congress to operate steamboats on the same route.
So you have a state license and a federal license.
Exactly, a recipe for conflict.
And of course they clash.
Ogden sued to stop Gibbons from operating in New York waters, arguing that New York had the right to regulate commerce within its own borders.
Again, that tension between state and federal authority.
Exactly. And the big constitutional questions in this case were about the Commerce Clause.
Article 1, Section 8.
Right, the part that gives Congress the power to regulate commerce among the several states.
And of course, just like in McCulloch, the Supremacy Clause was a major factor.
It always is when you have these federal-state clashes.
So how did the court rule in Gibbons?
Well, the court, with Chief Justice Marshall writing the opinion again, relied heavily on the principles from McCulloch.
They did.
They said that Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce was broad, and it included the power to regulate navigation.
So that federal license that Gibbons had,
Yeah.
that trumped the state-granted monopoly that Ogden was relying on.
Exactly, because the federal law licensing Gibbons directly conflicted with New York's attempt to control those steamboat routes.
The federal law won out under the Supremacy Clause.
Just like the court had interpreted it in McCulloch.
So it's like in McCulloch, Maryland's tax was seen as an unconstitutional way to mess with a federal entity.
Right.
And here in Gibbons, New York's exclusive licensing scheme was seen as an invalid way to obstruct illegitimate power of Congress to regulate commerce.
It's that same core principle that when there's a head-to-head conflict between a valid federal law and a state law, the federal law takes precedence.
Especially when it's an area where the federal government has clear constitutional authority.
Exactly. And the court's broad interpretation of commerce among the several states in Gibbons,
Right.
which was really influenced by McCulloch's emphasis on a strong federal government that really opened the door for a major expansion of federal power to regulate the economy in the years that followed.
It's like McCulloch laid the foundation and Gibbons built another level on top of it.
A great way to put it.
Okay, let's fast forward a bit now to a much more recent case.
Okay.
Gonzalez v. Raich in 2005, the medical marijuana case out of California.
Right. A very different set of facts, but the same core principles at play.
So where do we see the echoes of McCulloch in this case?
Well, in Rage, you had this clash between California's state law, which allowed for the use of medical marijuana,
Right.
and the Federal Controlled Substances Act, which banned marijuana completely.
So state law saying it's okay, federal law saying it's not.
Exactly, a classic federal-state conflict.
And which part of the Constitution was at the heart of this case?
The Commerce Clause, again, front and center.
Right. So the argument against the federal government's power in this case
Yeah.
was that if someone is growing and using medical marijuana entirely within the state of California,
Right.
and it's not being bought or sold across state lines,
Yeah.
then Congress shouldn't be able to regulate it.
That was the core of their argument.
It's about drawing a line between what's truly interstate commerce and what's purely local.
Right.
But how did the court rule?
They sided with the federal government,
They did.
upholding the federal ban on marijuana even when it came to medical use within a single state.
So even though it seemed like a purely local activity,
Yeah.
the court said the federal government still had the power to regulate it.
And they base this on a precedent from an earlier case, Wickard v. Filburn,
Okay.
which established this idea that Congress can regulate even activities that seem purely local.
Right.
If when you add them all up across the country, they could have a significant impact on interstate commerce.
So it's like saying even a small-scale local activity can be part of a bigger national picture.
Exactly.
And if that bigger picture involves interstate commerce, then Congress has the power to step in.
That's the logic.
But what's really interesting about Raich in the context of McCulloch
Yeah.
is Justice Scalia's concurring opinion.
Right. Justice Scalia, often a champion of states' rights.
Yeah.
But in this case, he actually sided with the majority.
He did.
And he specifically invoked the necessary and proper clause as a justification for applying the federal ban.
So even to that purely intrastate medical marijuana use,
Right.
he said that prohibiting that local cultivation and use was necessary for the federal government to effectively enforce the broader ban on marijuana in the interstate market.
It was about making sure the federal law could actually work.
So even though the specific activity in Raich seemed very localized, Scalia argued that it was necessary and proper for Congress to regulate it in order to carry out its bigger power to regulate interstate commerce in drugs.
Right. It's all about connecting the specific action to the broader constitutional power.
That logic sounds very similar to McCulloch, right?
It does.
Where the national bank itself wasn't specifically listed in the Constitution.
Right.
But the court said it was necessary for Congress to manage the nation's finances effectively.
It's that same idea that Congress's power isn't limited to just those actions that are spelled out word for word in the Constitution.
Right.
It extends to those actions that are reasonably necessary to carry out those listed powers.
Like the necessary and proper clause is a bridge,
Yeah.
connecting those specific actions to those broader constitutional powers.
A bridge between the specific and the general.
Okay, so we've looked at Gibbons and Raich.
Right. Two very different cases, but with that common thread of McCulloch running through them.
Now let's tackle one last case.
Okay.
National Federation of Independent Business v. Sebelius from 2012.
The Affordable Care Act case.
The Affordable Care Act case, a landmark decision in its own right.
Absolutely.
So how does McCulloch's legacy play into this case?
Well, the challenge to the individual mandate in NFIB v. Sebelius.
Right, the part of the ACA that required most people to have health insurance.
Exactly. That provision really sparked a debate about the limits of federal power.
So how did the arguments in that case connect back to McCulloch?
The arguments on both sides of the individual mandate debate brought up the Commerce Clause and the Necessary and Proper Clause.
Just like in McCulloch.
Right. It's like these clauses are the battlegrounds for so many of these federalism debates.
So those who supported the individual mandate,
Yeah.
they said it was a valid use of Congress's power to regulate commerce
Right.
and that it was necessary to make sure the health insurance market worked properly.
Because a well-functioning health insurance market is a big part of the national economy.
Right, it affects interstate commerce.
Exactly.
But those who opposed the mandate,
Yeah.
they said it went too far.
They argued that Congress was overstepping its bounds.
Right, that the mandate exceeded Congress's power under the Commerce Clause because it was forcing people to engage in commerce.
By buying health insurance,
Right.
rather than just regulating commerce that was already happening.
Is that distinction between compelling someone to do something versus regulating an existing activity?
Exactly. And they also argued that it was stretching the Necessary and Proper Clause too far.
Saying that requiring people to buy health insurance wasn't truly necessary to regulate interstate commerce.
Right. It was a debate about the limits of those implied powers.
So even though the court ultimately upheld the individual mandate,
They did, but not based on the Commerce Clause.
Right. They upheld it based on Congress's power to tax.
Exactly. But even though the outcome wasn't directly tied to the Commerce Clause,
Yeah.
the whole debate still centered on these fundamental questions about the scope of Congress's powers.
The same questions that were at the heart of McCulloch.
Exactly. It's like McCulloch cast a long shadow over this debate.
So even though the court ended up using a different legal justification to uphold the mandate,
Yeah.
the core tension was still there. That tension between federal power and state power.
A tension that's been a part of American constitutional law since the very beginning.
And it's fascinating how the dissenting justices in NFIB,
Yeah.
those who would have struck down the mandate entirely,
Right.
they argued for a much more limited view of the Commerce Clause and the necessary and proper clause.
They did.
They were really emphasizing the importance of protecting state sovereignty.
Which is a concern that echoes all the way back to Maryland's arguments in McCulloch.
Right, that fear of an overreaching federal government encroaching on the powers of the states.
It shows how those early debates about federalism are still relevant today.
So even though NFIB involved a very different issue than McCulloch,
Yeah.
healthcare versus banking,
The underlying principles and the arguments being made.
they all trace back to those fundamental questions that McCulloch first grappled with.
Okay, so we've looked at these 4 landmark cases.
We have.
McCulloch, Gibbons, Raich, and NFIB.
Spanning over almost 2 centuries of Supreme Court jurisprudence.
Exactly. So when we look at them all together, what are the big takeaways?
Well, the most obvious connection is that they all deal with this ongoing tug-of-war between federal power and state sovereignty.
That seems to be a theme that runs through so much of American history.
It really does. It's baked into the structure of our government.
So each of these cases, just like McCulloch, involves a situation where someone is questioning how far the federal government's authority actually reaches. Right. Is this something the federal government has the power to do?
Especially in relation to those powers that states have traditionally held.
Exactly. It's about drawing those lines in the sand.
And another common thread is the importance of interpreting those core powers that the Constitution gives to Congress.
Right, like the Commerce Clause.
Yeah.
And figuring out how far those powers can extend, especially when you factor in the necessary and proper clause.
The source of those implied powers.
Exactly. The idea that Congress can take actions that aren't explicitly listed in the Constitution.
Right.
If those actions are reasonably necessary to carry out its listed powers.
And underpinning all of this is the principle of federal supremacy.
That bedrock idea that when a federal law and a state law directly clash,
Yeah.
the federal law wins out.
Which was a key part of the outcome in McCulloch.
It was the principle that really tipped the scales in that case.
So McCulloch established this framework for understanding how federal and state laws interact.
It's like the Constitution is a blueprint, and McCulloch provided some of the key instructions.
And all these later cases we've looked at,
Yeah.
they're basically trying to apply those instructions to different situations.
They're wrestling with the same fundamental questions about federalism, but in new contexts.
It's amazing how these cases that are dealing with things like steamboats and drugs and healthcare
Yeah. Issues that the framers of the Constitution could have never imagined.
keep coming back to these core principles from a case that's over 200 years old.
It shows how enduring those principles really are.
So to sum it all up for you, our listener,
Yeah,
McCulloch v. Maryland was a groundbreaking case.
it really was.
It wasn't just about a bank or a tax.
No, it was about defining the very nature of our federal system.
It laid the groundwork for a stronger, more flexible federal government.
And those principles that it established,
Yeah.
they continue to shape the laws that govern us today.
They're not just history. They're very much alive in our legal system.
They are.
And it really makes you think about how these ideas of implied powers and federal supremacy actually play out in your own life.
Right. How do they affect the laws and regulations that you encounter every day?
It's worth considering the benefits and the drawbacks of a strong federal government.
Versus a system that gives more power to the states.
It's a debate that's been going on for centuries, and it's still relevant today.
Absolutely.
So we encourage you to keep exploring these landmark cases.
Yeah.
And to keep thinking about this ongoing conversation about the balance of power in our federal system.
It's a conversation that we all have a stake in.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.